The air was thick with dust and silence. Buildings that once stood proudly were now nothing more than cracked walls and broken stones. Streets were empty, windows shattered, and smoke drifted slowly between the ruins. It was hard to believe that this place had once been full of laughter, families, and the sound of daily life. Now, only echoes remained. For weeks, the people trapped inside this small town had waited for help. Every morning, they looked toward the hills, hoping to see someone, anyone, coming to rescue them. But no one came. Each sunrise felt colder and each night stretched longer. The sounds of distant explosions had become part of their lives, like thunder that never stopped. Inside a damaged building that had once been a school, a small group of survivors huddled together. The roof was half gone, and rain sometimes fell through the open gaps. They had covered the holes with plastic sheets, but it didn't help much. In one corner, an old man tried to light a small fire using scraps of wood. The smoke burned their eyes, yet they stayed close because the fire was the only warmth left. Children sat quietly, too weak to cry. Their mothers held them close, whispering soft words that no longer carried comfort. The men looked out through the cracks in the wall, watching the horizon for any movement. They had stopped counting days. Time had lost its meaning here. The town had once been a peaceful place surrounded by green fields. People grew crops, traded in the market, and lived simple lives. But when the war came, everything changed. Armies clashed, roads were cut off, and soon this small town became a battleground. Many had fled before the fighting reached them, but those who stayed behind couldn't leave, either because they were too old, too young, or simply had nowhere to go. At first, they believed the soldiers would protect them. They trusted the world outside would not forget them. But as the fighting grew worse, all communication stopped. Phones went silent. Electricity failed. The radio picked up nothing but static. The people realized they had been left alone. Every day they searched the ruined houses for food. Sometimes they found canned goods buried under rubble, or bags of rice covered in dust. They boiled dirty water to drink. A few people got sick and there were no doctors left to help. Medicines were gone. Bandages were made from torn cloth. Still, they tried to survive, believing that rescue might come. One night a heavy rain fell. The wind howled through the broken streets, shaking loose pieces of walls and roof tiles. Inside the school, people gathered together to stay warm. Someone began to hum an old song, a tune that once played during festivals long before the war. Slowly, others joined in. For a short while, their voices filled the room. It reminded them that they were still human, still alive even in this darkness. But hope is fragile when hunger and fear rule. As days passed, the sound of gunfire came closer. The old man who built fires said quietly, "They're coming nearer." No one asked who they were. Everyone already knew. The group started hiding whenever they heard engines or boots outside. The youngest among them were told to stay silent no matter what happened. They learned to breathe quietly, to stay still even when fear made their hearts race. A simple cough could draw danger. Life had turned into a game of silence and waiting. One morning, the survivors woke to find the sky covered in thick gray clouds. The sun didn't shine through. Smoke from nearby battles mixed with the clouds, turning everything into a blur of shadow. In the distance, something exploded. The sound rolled over the hills and into the valley, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Dust fell from the ceiling and one of the children began to cry. "Shh," someone whispered, pulling the child close. "It's okay. It's far away," but it wasn't far. They all knew that. As the day went on, they heard more explosions, closer, sharper. The ground trembled again and again. By evening, parts of the town were on fire. The survivors could see the glow of flames through the holes in the walls. The smell of burning wood and plastic filled the air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then fell silent. Night came quickly. The sky glowed orange in the distance, and no stars were visible. The people in the school basement decided not to light a fire that night. The light might give away their position. They sat in the dark, whispering only when necessary. The children clung to their mothers. Everyone could hear their own heartbeat. At midnight, the sound of footsteps echoed down the street. Heavy boots moving slowly. The survivors froze. The old man signaled for silence. No one moved. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then a voice spoke, harsh, foreign, and commanding. No one understood the words, but the tone was enough. The group didn't breathe. The sound of a weapon being loaded broke the silence, followed by laughter. Then the footsteps moved on. Only after several minutes did anyone dare to move again. A woman began to sob quietly, pressing her hand against her mouth to keep the sound low. When morning came, the world outside was quiet again, but it wasn't peace. Smoke covered the sky and ashes floated down like snow. The town was barely recognizable now. The survivors looked out through cracks in the wall and saw the ruins of their old lives. The bakery was gone. The small clinic had collapsed. The marketplace where people once traded fruits and clothes was just a pile of rubble. Someone whispered, "We can't stay here forever," but there was nowhere else to go. The roads were blocked and anyone who tried to leave never returned. Some said the forest beyond the hill was full of armed men. Others believed the river was mined. No one wanted to test if those rumors were true. By the third week, hope had turned into habit. They no longer talked about rescue. They simply focused on staying alive one more day. Every sound outside made them jump, every silence felt heavy. The old man who had once smiled at the children now sat quietly, staring at the fire until it burned out. One evening, as the last light of day faded, a young woman found an old photo buried under the rubble. It showed a group of people laughing in front of the same school they were hiding in now. She showed it to the others, and for a moment everyone stopped to look. The faces in the picture were happy, full of life. It felt like a message from another world. Some smiled through tears. It reminded them that the town had once been more than a war zone. It had been home. That night, a small argument broke out. One man wanted to try escaping through the old road near the river. Another said it was too dangerous, that they would only die faster. Voices rose, then softened. In the end, no one moved. Fear was stronger than courage. The next morning, they woke to silence. No explosions, no footsteps, no shouting. Only wind moving through broken windows. For a moment, they thought maybe the fighting had ended. Some dared to step outside for the first time in days. The streets were covered in dust, but the sky had cleared a little. A faint blue peeked through the smoke. It gave them a tiny spark of hope. They gathered what little they had left, some dry food, a few bottles of water, and the small radio they had been trying to fix for days. They turned the knob, hoping to catch a signal. Static filled the room. Then, for a brief second, a voice broke through. It was faint and unclear, but it was human. Everyone leaned closer. "Say it again," someone whispered. But the voice was gone. Only static remained. Even though it lasted just a few seconds, that moment changed the air in the room. For the first time in weeks, people looked at each other with something close to belief. If someone out there was still speaking, maybe they weren't forgotten after all. Maybe, just maybe, help could still come. That night they didn't sleep easily, but the silence felt different. Not like the silence of fear, but of waiting. Hope, faint and fragile, had returned to the hearts of the forgotten. And none of them knew that far beyond the hills, someone had indeed heard that broken signal. Someone was already preparing to come, just not yet. The days that followed were quiet but not peaceful. The sound of fighting had moved farther away, yet fear still hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. The people hiding inside the old school had begun to feel the weight of every passing hour. Hunger had made them weak and the cold nights were growing longer. They were caught between wanting to believe that help would come and preparing themselves for the truth that maybe no one ever would. The air inside the basement was stale. They had spent so many days there that even the children had stopped asking questions. Their eyes were dull, tired from seeing only darkness. Sometimes, when the wind blew through the broken windows, a faint smell of rain or burnt metal would drift in. The adults looked at the children and wished they could give them something more than silence and small pieces of dry bread. Every morning, one or two of them went out to look for food. It was dangerous, but there was no choice. They moved carefully through the ruined streets, always listening before turning a corner. They searched empty houses, overturned furniture, and broken shelves. Sometimes they found nothing. Other times they found small things that felt like treasures. Half a can of beans, a bag of rice spilled across the floor, or a few bottles of clean water. When they came back, the others waited like it was a celebration. The food was divided carefully, so everyone got at least a bite. The old man who once built the fires no longer spoke much, but he kept watch at the doorway. He said little, but his eyes were sharp. He listened to the faraway sounds and could tell when trouble was near. The others trusted his quiet sense of knowing. When he said stay inside, they stayed. When he said, "It's clear," they moved. At night, the basement turned into a place of whispers. They talked about life before the war, the festivals, the schools, the sound of laughter in the streets. One woman spoke about her small shop where she used to sell bread. Another man remembered fixing bicycles for the neighborhood children. Talking about the past was painful, but it reminded them that they had once lived freely. It gave them a reason to keep holding on. One afternoon, as the sun tried to push through the thick clouds, a young boy climbed up the stairs to look outside. The street was empty, covered in dust and debris. A dog limped across the road, sniffing at the ground, and disappeared behind a wall. The boy watched quietly for a moment, then whispered to himself, "The world is still out there." That night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the cracks and rain poured down hard. The people huddled close, listening to the thunder. Every time lightning flashed, the room lit up for a second, showing their tired faces. One of the children started to cry, afraid of the sound. A woman pulled him close and began to tell a story, not one about war but about stars. She spoke softly, describing how stars were tiny lights that could guide lost travelers home. Her voice was calm, and slowly the boy stopped crying. Others listened too, letting her words carry them far away from the storm even for a few minutes. The next morning, when the rain stopped, the world looked washed but broken. The streets were muddy and pools of water reflected the gray sky. A few of the survivors stepped outside to collect rainwater. They used old bottles, pans, anything that could hold a few drops. Every drop mattered. The radio that they had been trying to fix still sat on a wooden box. It was their only connection to the outside world, even though it had been silent for days. One of the younger men spent hours adjusting its wires and knobs. Most of the time, it gave nothing but static, but once in a while a faint crackle made everyone hold their breath. It became a small ritual. Each evening they gathered around the radio, hoping to hear a voice. The silence that followed each failed attempt was heavy, but no one said it out loud. Hope had become a quiet thing now, not spoken but shared in small gestures. When someone shared their last piece of bread, or when someone smiled even after a long day, it meant hope was still alive. One day, the old man who guarded the doorway didn't return from his short watch outside. Hours passed and people began to worry. A small group decided to search for him. They followed his usual path, moving carefully through the ruins. They found him sitting near the remains of the old marketplace. His face was calm and he was holding something in his hand, a small flag covered in dust. He said softly, "I thought I saw something in the distance. Maybe a light, maybe just a reflection." They helped him back to the basement, but the moment stayed with everyone. Was it a light? Or just another illusion born from exhaustion and hope? No one could be sure. Still, that night they talked about what he saw. The idea that there might be movement somewhere, someone out there, brought a new kind of energy to the group. Days continued to pass. The food supply was running out again. The sound of distant machines could sometimes be heard, but it was impossible to tell if they were friendly or not. The survivors decided to send out 2 people to explore beyond the town's edge. They waited until dawn when the fog was thick enough to cover their movements. The 2 slipped away quietly, promising to return by sunset. The rest of the group waited all day. Every noise outside made their hearts race. The sun sank lower, painting the ruins in shades of gold and gray. But the 2 did not return. When darkness fell, a quiet fear spread through the room. No one spoke of it, but everyone felt it. Losing anyone was like losing a part of themselves. That night, they lit a small fire again for the first time in days. It wasn't much, but the glow gave them comfort. One of the older women began to hum softly. Others joined her, just as they had before. The song carried through the cracked walls, gentle and haunting. It was not a song of joy, but of survival. Even in their weakness, they found a way to remind themselves that they were still here. The next morning, something strange happened. The young man fixing the radio suddenly heard a faint sound, just a few broken words, but it was enough to freeze everyone in place. He turned the dial carefully and a weak voice came through, covered in static. It was speaking in their language. The voice said something about coordinates and evacuation point, then it disappeared again. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the room filled with whispers. Could it be real? Was someone actually out there calling for survivors? The young man tried to bring the signal back, but it was gone. Still, they couldn't forget the sound of that voice. It was proof that somewhere beyond the gray sky and ruined streets, human voices still existed. The people began to plan quietly. If there was an evacuation point, maybe they could reach it. Maybe that was the reason they were still alive, to hold on just long enough to be found. The idea brought a new kind of strength to them. They started saving food again, organizing what little they had left. The old man smiled faintly for the first time in weeks. As night fell, the wind grew softer. The children slept close to their parents. The flickering firelight danced across their faces, showing expressions not of fear but of waiting. In the distance, the sound of thunder returned, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the thunder of storm clouds. It was deep and steady, like something powerful moving through the sky. The survivors looked at one another. No one spoke, but everyone felt it in their bones. Something was coming. They didn't know if it was danger or salvation, but it was coming. And for the first time, they didn't feel completely alone. The night passed slowly. Outside, the wind whispered through the broken windows, carrying with it the faint hum of something far away, like engines in the sky. No one dared to believe it fully yet, but deep down in the quiet corner of every heart, a spark had been lit again, a spark that said maybe tomorrow wouldn't be like yesterday. Maybe, just maybe, the silence was about to end. The morning came slowly, covered in a dull gray light that slipped through the cracks of the ruined school. The people inside woke one by one, stretching their stiff limbs and rubbing sleep from their eyes. The radio still sat on the table, quiet again after the short message they had heard the night before. Some of them had dreamed of that voice, the broken words that spoke of coordinates and an evacuation point. It had sounded too real to be just noise. Now, as they looked at the radio, they wondered if it would ever speak again. The old man was the first to move. He poked at the ashes of the small fire that had burned through the night, stirring faint sparks into life. A few children huddled near him, trying to warm their hands. Their faces were thin, but their eyes carried something new: curiosity. It was strange to see children look at the world with interest again. One of the women handed out what little food was left. There wasn't much, just a few crumbs of bread and a cup of thin soup made from boiled leaves. Yet everyone took their share quietly, saving even the smallest bite. Outside, the air was still. Smoke hung low and the sky looked heavy. No birds sang anymore, no engines roared in the distance. The world had grown too silent, as if it was holding its breath. Still, the memory of that voice had changed something inside the survivors. It gave them a reason to move, to act, to try one more time. After finishing their small meal, the young man who had been fixing the radio started working again. He twisted the knob slowly, hoping to catch that same signal. The others watched in silence, eyes focused on his hands. For hours nothing happened, only static and faint cracks of sound. Then suddenly a short burst of noise came through. It was faint but clear enough to make everyone freeze. Emergency. Survivors. Location. Repeat. The voice faded out before they could understand more. Still, those few words sent a shiver through the room. Someone was out there, still broadcasting, still searching. It was proof that the outside world hadn't completely forgotten them. The old man nodded slowly. "We have to answer," he said in a quiet voice. Everyone looked at him. For a moment, the idea felt impossible. The radio was fragile, half broken, and they didn't even know if it could send a signal out. But the thought of doing nothing felt worse. They couldn't wait forever in silence. The young man adjusted the wires again, connecting a few pieces of metal they had scavenged from old machines. They found a working battery from a broken flashlight and used it to give the radio a bit more power. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. When everything was ready, they gathered around the table. The old man leaned forward, his hand trembling slightly as he pressed the small button on the side. The radio made a faint click. Everyone held their breath. He spoke slowly, clearly, hoping his words could travel far. "To anyone who can hear this, we are alive. We are trapped in the southern part of the valley near the broken school. We have wounded people and children, please. If anyone can hear us, we need help." He released the button. The radio hissed and crackled. Nothing came back. For a long time, no one moved. They just stared at the small box sitting on the table. Then someone whispered, "Try again." The old man nodded. He pressed the button again and repeated the message. His voice shook a little, but he didn't stop. He spoke 3 times, pausing after each attempt. Then they waited. The silence that followed was unbearable. Minutes felt like hours. The air seemed heavy enough to crush their hope. Then, just when they began to give up, the radio came alive again. Message received. Hold position. Stand by. The voice was broken by static, but they heard enough. Their message had reached someone. For a moment, the basement filled with quiet cries and gasps. People hugged each other, some laughing softly through tears. It was the first good news they'd heard in months, but the voice faded quickly and no other message came through. The young man tapped the side of the radio, but it was useless. The connection was gone again. Still, the old man smiled faintly. "They heard us," he whispered. "That's enough." The rest of the day passed slowly. The survivors took turns listening to the radio, waiting for another signal. None came. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of distant burning. The sky darkened early, and by evening the air was cold again. Inside, they lit a small fire using pieces of broken furniture. The orange light flickered on the walls, painting their tired faces with warmth. For the first time, people talked with energy. They began to wonder what would happen next. Would the soldiers come? Would they find them soon? Each person imagined it differently, but all shared the same feeling. Something had changed. That night, the young man couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the voice that answered. He replayed it in his mind, every word, every sound. It hadn't sounded far away. Maybe it came from the nearby hills. If that was true, help could be closer than they thought. Before dawn, he quietly climbed up the stairs and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp, and the ground was covered in ash. He looked toward the hills, but they were hidden under fog. Somewhere out there, someone was listening. That thought gave him strength. When he returned inside, he told the old man his idea. "We should try again," he said softly. "Maybe send the message at sunrise. It's when signals travel better." The old man agreed. So as the first light broke over the ruined town, they powered up the radio once more. The group gathered around again, their faces tense with hope. The young man pressed the button and spoke, his voice steady. "We are still here. Please confirm if you can hear us." They waited. Seconds passed. Then came a faint reply. "Copy. Hold. We're coming." The words were soft, broken, but clear enough. They echoed in the small room like music. The people froze, then began to smile. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. It was real this time. Someone was on their way. The next few hours were filled with restless energy. People began to clean the room, gather supplies, and pack what little they had. The old man reminded them to stay calm. "They may not come today," he said gently, "but they are coming. That's what matters." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying distant rumbling sounds. It could have been thunder or engines. No one could tell for sure. Still, every sound now made them hopeful. By evening, the radio went silent once more, but they didn't feel fear this time. They knew their signal had reached someone. Help was not a dream anymore, it was a promise. That night, no one sang or told stories. They simply sat together in quiet comfort, listening to the faint crackle of the fire. The children slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. When the sky grew darker, a few of the adults went outside to keep watch. The air was cool and still. In the far distance, flashes of light danced near the horizon. Not lightning, but something else. The old man narrowed his eyes. "Those aren't storms," he whispered. The others followed his gaze. It was faint, but there was no mistake. Something was moving out there, lighting up the clouds with every pulse. They didn't know what it meant yet, but it made their hearts beat faster. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. Maybe it was the answer they had been waiting for since the world went dark. As the night deepened, the survivors took turns watching the horizon. The radio sat quietly beside them, its small red light blinking weakly. Each time the wind moved through the ruins, they thought they heard distant voices. The world beyond the hills was waking up again. The young man looked at the radio one last time before sleeping. "They're coming," he whispered to himself, smiling faintly. They said they're coming. And though the fire burned low, no one in that room felt the cold anymore. Hope had finally found its way back into their lives, and this time it wasn't leaving. Somewhere beyond the silence, help was on the move. They just had to hold on a little longer. The next morning began with a strange stillness, the kind that makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. The survivors inside the old school woke early. No one spoke much. Everyone was listening, to the air, to the wind, to anything that sounded out of place. The radio had gone quiet again, but no one lost hope. They had heard the words clearly last time. Someone was coming. That single promise kept their hearts beating with purpose. The old man sat by the window looking out toward the horizon. The fog had lifted and the gray sky was clearer than it had been in weeks. A faint breeze carried the smell of rain and smoke mixed together. He whispered to himself, "The world is moving again." Down in the basement, the others were preparing. The young man checked the batteries of the radio again, cleaning the dust from its surface even though it barely worked. The women gathered the few supplies they had left: water, a bit of bread, a small cloth bag filled with dried leaves for tea. They weren't sure what the day would bring, but they wanted to be ready. For the first time in many days, there was quiet excitement instead of fear. The children could sense it too. They didn't cry or hide anymore. One of them asked softly, "When will they come?" And a woman smiled weakly and said, "Soon, my dear, very soon." As the sun climbed higher, a low rumbling sound began to roll through the air. At first, they thought it was thunder. The sound grew louder, heavier, like a giant heartbeat in the sky. The old man stood up, staring through the cracked window. "That's not thunder," he said, his voice trembling. "Listen." Everyone went silent. The rumble grew stronger until the walls began to shake slightly. Dust fell from the ceiling. The young man ran to the doorway and looked up. Through the gray clouds, faint dark shapes were moving. Too steady to be clouds, too fast to be birds. The first helicopter appeared over the ridge, its blades cutting through the smoky sky. The wind it created blew through the ruins, stirring dust into wild circles. Behind it came another and then another. The survivors froze in disbelief. They had dreamed of rescue, but none of them truly imagined they would see it. The children ran to the door, eyes wide with wonder. Some of the adults pulled them back gently, afraid it could still be a trick. But when the first helicopter circled above the town and released a flare of bright light, they knew. These were human soldiers. They were not enemies. They were here for them. The sound of engines filled the air, echoing through the broken streets. The survivors stepped outside slowly, covering their eyes from the dust. The wind from the helicopters was strong enough to bend the trees that still stood. A voice came from above, echoing through a speaker, calling out instructions. It was hard to hear the words, but they recognized the tone. It was calm, firm, human. Moments later, ropes dropped from one of the helicopters, and figures in heavy suits began to descend. Their movements were quick and precise. The ground trembled as they landed, their boots stirring the dirt. They carried packs and equipment, not weapons raised for attack. The survivors could only stare. One of the soldiers raised a hand in a friendly signal. The old man took a hesitant step forward, then another. "We're alive!" he shouted, his voice breaking. "We're here!" The soldier gave a thumbs up, and through the radio strapped to his chest, he spoke words that made everyone cry at once. "We've got them." Survivors confirmed. The others came running out, waving pieces of cloth, calling out, crying, laughing all at once. For the first time in months, their voices were not whispers of fear but shouts of relief. The soldiers moved quickly, checking the area, setting up a small perimeter. One of them knelt down to help a woman who had fallen to her knees from shock. Another handed a child a bottle of water. The little one held it like it was the most precious thing in the world. Then more helicopters arrived, and soon the sky was full of sound. The earth shook as supplies were lowered, boxes of food, medicine, and blankets. The soldiers worked with calm focus, their movements sure and practiced. They didn't waste a single second, but they treated everyone with care. The survivors couldn't stop watching them. These men and women looked like people who had been through their own battles. Faces tired, eyes serious, uniforms covered in dust. Yet there was something powerful about them. They carried not just strength but compassion. A young soldier knelt beside the radio that had carried the survivors' desperate message. He smiled faintly, almost as if greeting an old friend. "This little thing saved you," he said quietly. The young man who had repaired it nodded, his eyes full of gratitude. As the rescue continued, the sound of engines grew louder from beyond the hills. Heavy machines were moving in the distance, vehicles perhaps armored. The soldiers around the school exchanged quick looks. One of them spoke into his headset, and soon the tone of their movements changed. They formed protective positions, their expressions turning serious. The old man noticed the shift and asked softly, "Is something wrong?" The soldier didn't answer directly, but looked toward the horizon. "Not anymore," he said. "You're safe now." Moments later, the ground shook again, but this time it wasn't from helicopters. In the distance, flashes of light filled the hills. Deep booms echoed across the valley. The soldiers weren't just rescuing, they were fighting something unseen beyond the ridge. The survivors couldn't see what was happening, but they could feel it. Despite the noise, no one panicked. The soldiers' calm presence made them feel protected. For the first time, the survivors didn't flinch at every sound. They trusted these people completely. When the fighting in the distance quieted down, the sky began to clear. The smoke thinned and sunlight broke through for the first time in what felt like years. The helicopters hovered lower, and voices shouted that it was time to evacuate. The soldiers helped the survivors onto stretchers and carried the weak. The children were lifted with care. The old man refused to be carried. He walked slowly, one step at a time, looking around at the town he had once called home. The walls were broken, the streets destroyed. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a graveyard. It felt like the beginning of something new. As the last group prepared to board, a loud deep sound rolled across the valley. Everyone looked up. A massive transport aircraft was descending slowly through the clouds, larger than any helicopter they had seen. Its shadow covered the ruins. The wind it created was fierce, and the dust swirled around them like a storm. The children pointed and gasped. The soldiers smiled. "Home is coming for you," one of them said. One by one, the survivors were loaded aboard. Inside, the air smelled clean and warm. Seats lined the walls, and medical workers moved between them, checking pulses, giving water, wrapping blankets around trembling shoulders. The young man looked out the window as they lifted off. The town grew smaller below him. The broken streets, the shattered roofs, the lonely trees. It all faded under the shadow of smoke and sunlight. As the aircraft climbed higher, he saw the hills glowing with flashes again. Far below, human machines moved with purpose. It looked like a wave of power spreading outward, pushing away the chaos that had ruled for too long. Inside, a soft voice came through the speakers. "This is the rescue convoy. All survivors are safe. Mission complete," the words echoed through the cabin. Some began to cry quietly. Others closed their eyes in relief. The old man leaned back, breathing deeply for the first time in months. "I told you," he whispered to the young man beside him. "They heard us." The aircraft broke through the last layer of clouds, and sunlight filled the cabin. It was bright, golden, almost too much to look at after so many dark days. The survivors shielded their eyes but smiled through the light. Far below, the war-torn valley lay silent again. But now it carried something new, hope. And above it, cutting through the silence like thunder, the human ships soared. They had come not just as rescuers, but as a promise that no one would ever be left behind again. For those who had waited in darkness, the sound of the helicopters had not just pierced the sky, it had pierced despair itself. And everything, truly everything, had changed. The sound of the engine slowly faded as the aircraft flew higher into the sky. Inside, the survivors sat quietly, still trying to believe what had happened. For months they had lived with fear and silence, and now the steady hum of the plane felt like a heartbeat, strong, alive, human. The air smelled of clean metal and medicine. Warm lights glowed above them. It was the first time in a long while that anyone had felt safe. A young woman sitting near the window kept staring outside. The clouds looked like soft mountains, endless and white. Below them, the world was hidden, as if all the pain had been left behind under that thick layer of mist. Across from her, the old man sat with his hands folded, eyes half closed. Every few minutes he would open them and glance around, just to make sure it wasn't a dream. One of the soldiers walked through the aisle, checking on everyone. His uniform was dusty, his face tired, but his eyes were kind. "You're safe now," he said quietly, as he handed a bottle of water to a boy who looked no older than 10. The boy nodded and held the bottle close, like a treasure. The young man who had repaired the radio sat in silence, holding the small device in his lap. It was broken again, cracked during the rescue, but he didn't care. That little piece of metal and wire had saved them. He turned it over in his hands as if it were a piece of history. A nurse came by with a blanket and gently placed it over his shoulders. "You did good," she said softly. He smiled a little but said nothing. The aircraft began to shake lightly as it moved through another layer of clouds. Outside, a faint orange glow lit the horizon. The soldiers looked at each other. It wasn't sunrise. It was the reflection of distant fires below. The world was still burning in places. Humanity was winning, but the cost had been great. When the aircraft finally steadied, one of the soldiers opened a small panel near the front. A screen flickered to life, showing a map filled with red and blue lights. The survivors couldn't understand much of it, but the soldiers did. The red zones were shrinking. That meant something important. Humans were pushing back. The old man leaned forward, his eyes wide. "Are we winning?" he asked quietly. The soldier looked at him and nodded once. "We are." Those two words filled the cabin with quiet joy. No one cheered loudly. They didn't have the energy, but they smiled, and for the first time their smiles reached their eyes. Hours later, the aircraft began to descend. Through the windows, the survivors saw something they hadn't seen in so long: lights. Bright white lights stretched across the ground below, forming shapes of tents, buildings, and runways. It was a human camp, massive, organized, alive. Vehicles moved in straight lines, soldiers marched, and doctors stood ready near the landing zones. As the aircraft landed, a soft voice came through the speakers. "Welcome to safe ground. You are home." When the doors opened, warm air rushed in. It smelled of smoke, fuel, and something sweet. Real food cooking somewhere nearby. The survivors blinked as they stepped out. The sunlight was harsh, but it felt good on their skin. They had lived so long in darkness that even pain from the brightness felt like a gift. People in uniforms ran forward to help. Some guided the weak to medical tents, others carried stretchers. Children were given blankets and candy. A few of the soldiers stayed close, keeping watch. Even in safety, they stayed alert. The young man looked around in amazement. Massive machines lined the field. Vehicles with the flag of Earth painted boldly on their sides. Drones flew overhead, scanning the skies. In the distance, towering walls made of steel and light surrounded the camp. Beyond them, smoke rose from battlefields where the fight still raged. It was hard to believe that this was all built by the same humans who once lived ordinary lives. The same people who built homes, schools, and cities had now built fortresses in the dirt, turning survival into strength. The survivors were led to a large tent where doctors checked their conditions. The young woman winced as her wounds were cleaned, but she didn't complain. The nurses worked quickly but with care. One of them said gently, "You're safe now. We'll take care of everything." The old man sat quietly on a cot, sipping warm soup from a metal cup. Tears filled his eyes with every sip. He hadn't tasted real food in months. "It's strange," he said softly to a soldier sitting beside him. "I thought I'd forgotten what warmth felt like." The soldier smiled faintly. "It's what we're fighting for," he said. As the day went on, the survivors began to see more of the camp. Some areas were full of rescued families, while others were dedicated to rebuilding and strategy. Soldiers moved with purpose, carrying supplies, repairing vehicles, checking maps. But despite all the activity, there was a deep sense of unity here. Every person knew their role. Later that night, the survivors gathered near a large fire pit. It wasn't just for warmth. It was a place for stories. The soldiers joined them, sharing quiet laughter and listening to the tales of survival. The young man told how they had kept the radio alive. The old man spoke about the moment they saw the first helicopter. Every word was filled with emotion. One of the soldiers, a woman with tired eyes but a calm voice, shared her story too. She said she had been part of the first rescue team sent after the world fell apart. "We lost contact with so many," she said softly, staring at the flames. "Every rescue we make feels like finding family again." Everyone around the fire nodded. No one felt like a stranger anymore. They were all part of the same story now, a story of endurance, courage, and hope. As the night grew colder, the young man stepped away from the fire and looked up at the sky. For the first time, it was clear. Stars shone brightly above, untouched by smoke. He thought about the world before everything changed. The calm nights, the city lights, the sound of laughter. It all felt so far away, yet somehow it was coming back. Humanity had not vanished. It had simply fought its way through the dark. Nearby, the old man slowly approached and stood beside him. "Do you hear that?" he asked. The young man listened. In the distance, faintly, came the sound of machines. Vehicles moving, helicopters landing, people working. It was the sound of life rebuilding itself. "Yes," he said softly. "It's the sound of home." The old man nodded, a small smile on his face. "Once I thought silence was peace," he said. "But I was wrong. This noise of people living, that's peace." They stood together in silence for a long time, watching the sky. The next morning, the camp was busier than ever. Orders were being given, new missions planned. The soldiers who had rescued them were preparing to leave again. They were going back into the ruins to find others still waiting. The young man approached one of them and said quietly, "You're leaving already?" The soldier nodded. "There are still more out there. People like you. We can't stop until everyone's found." The young man hesitated, then said, "If you ever hear a broken radio signal again, listen closely. Someone might be waiting just like we were." The soldier smiled. "We always listen." As the helicopters lifted off again, their sound filled the air. The survivors watched as they disappeared into the horizon, heading toward danger once more. But now no one felt fear. They felt pride. Humanity had learned to stand again, to fight not for power but for each other. The old man sat on a bench near the tents, holding the small radio in his hands. It no longer worked, but he kept it close. It reminded him of everything they had been through. When a nurse asked him why he carried it, he smiled and said, "Because this little thing once carried a voice across the silence, and that voice brought hope." As night fell once more, the camp lights glowed across the land like stars fall into earth. The survivors slept peacefully for the first time in months. Beyond the walls, the distant sounds of battle continued, but now it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the turning point of a new beginning. Humanity had faced the edge of extinction and refused to fall. And far above, cutting through clouds and darkness alike, the human ship still moved, brave, unstoppable, shining symbols of what it meant to never give up hope. The morning came slowly, with a soft golden light spreading across the horizon. The camp that had been alive all night with movement was now calm. A few guards walked along the fences, their boots crunching on the gravel, while the smell of freshly cooked food drifted through the cool air. The survivors woke one by one, their eyes heavy but peaceful. For the first time in what felt like forever, they had slept without fear. The young man sat outside his tent, looking at the rising sun. It was warm, gentle, and quiet, the kind of sunrise that once meant nothing special, but now it felt like a miracle. He took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs. Around him, the camp was slowly waking up too. Soldiers were checking their equipment. Doctors were preparing medicines, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of laughter could be heard. The old man came walking toward him, leaning on a wooden stick one of the soldiers had carved for him. His steps were slow, but there was strength in his eyes again. He looked at the young man and smiled. "We made it," he said softly. The young man nodded. "Yes, we really did." They stood there quietly for a while, watching the sky turn from orange to blue. It felt strange, peaceful, almost unreal. After months of fear and struggle, calm felt like something from another life. A soldier approached them carrying a clipboard. "Good morning," he said politely. "There's a briefing happening in the main tent. Command wants everyone to hear the latest updates." The survivors followed him to the large tent near the center of the camp. Inside, maps covered the walls, showing cities and regions marked with different colors. There were soldiers, engineers, and civilians standing together, listening as a commander spoke. "The operation was successful," the commander said, pointing to the maps. "Several survivor groups have been rescued. More are being tracked as we speak. Humanity's rebuilding efforts are underway across multiple zones. This is not just survival anymore, it's recovery." A quiet cheer rose from the group. The survivors looked at one another, realizing they weren't alone in their struggle. There were thousands more like them, people who had endured, fought, and waited for rescue. After the meeting, the young man walked through the camp, taking in everything around him. There were engineers building small homes from metal panels. Medical teams treated new arrivals who looked just as lost as he once had. A group of children played near a water tank, their laughter echoing across the field. It was a sound that made him stop and smile. Later in the day, a gentle breeze blew through the camp. The flag of Earth, stitched with blue and white, waved above the command post. It wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was a reminder that humanity still stood united. The old man spent most of his time talking to the newcomers, telling them how the soldiers had found their group. His voice carried a quiet pride, and people listened with awe. "They came when we thought no one would," he said. "And that's what humans do. We come for each other." As the sun reached its highest point, the camp loudspeakers came alive with a clear voice. "Attention. Rescue units have returned from Sector 9. All survivors are accounted for. Mission success." Cheers filled the camp. Some clapped, others hugged. Even the soldiers allowed themselves a rare smile. Each success meant another piece of the broken world was being mended. That afternoon, the young man visited the repair tent. He placed the old radio, the same one that had sent their message, on a table. An engineer looked at it curiously. "Where'd you find this?" he asked. "It found us," the young man said with a faint smile. The engineer chuckled. "Well, let's see if we can make it sing again." Hours later, as the sky began to darken, a small static sound came from the radio's speaker. Then a faint signal, weak but alive. The young man's eyes widened. The engineer tuned it carefully until the message became clear. "This is Unit Echo. Survivors located north of the ridge. Requesting assistance." The young man's heart raced. "They're out there," he whispered. "Others are still out there." The message repeated, and within minutes the soldiers were already preparing a new rescue team. Helicopters were refueled, supplies loaded. The camp turned busy again, not in panic but in purpose. Everyone knew what needed to be done. As the rescue units took off once more, the young man watched from the edge of the landing zone. The old man stood beside him, holding his stick tightly. The roar of engines filled the air, stirring dust around their feet. "They'll find them," the old man said with quiet certainty. "I know they will," the young man replied. "They always do." When the last helicopter disappeared beyond the hills, the sky grew peaceful again. The camp lights flickered on, casting a soft glow across the land. The survivors gathered near the fire pit once more. They didn't talk much this time. They just sat together, sharing the warmth, watching sparks rise into the night sky. The stars shone brighter than before. It was as if the universe itself had opened its eyes again, watching over them. The young man lay on his back, staring upward. For the first time, he felt the quiet not as emptiness but as comfort. The silence no longer meant fear. It meant peace. He thought about everything they had been through, the days of hiding, the long nights of hunger, the hopeless waiting. All of it had led to this moment. They had survived not just because they were strong, but because they refused to stop believing that someone would come. And when the human soldiers arrived, everything had changed. Not just the world around them, but something deep inside too. As dawn approached again, the camp stirred with new life. The smell of coffee and warm bread filled the air. The survivors lined up to help however they could, some cleaning, others tending to the new arrivals. Humanity was no longer just surviving. It was rebuilding. A group of children drew pictures on pieces of scrap paper. One of them held up a drawing for the young man to see. It showed helicopters flying through the clouds, people waving below, and bright sunlight breaking through the sky. At the bottom, the child had written one word in shaky letters: "Hope." He smiled and gently patted the child's shoulder. "That's a good word," he said. "Never forget it." By midday, another message came through the repaired radio. News from the rescue teams. Survivors secured. Returning with 50 more. The camp erupted in cheers once again. The sound was full of energy and life. The old man, sitting in his usual spot near the tents, closed his eyes and whispered, "The world is healing." That night, when the young man looked up at the sky, he noticed something different. The stars seemed closer somehow, brighter. He realized that maybe it wasn't just the stars, it was him. The darkness no longer scared him. It reminded him of where they had been and how far they had come. As he lay down to rest, he heard the distant echo of engines once again, the soldiers returning from another mission. The steady rhythm of the helicopters felt almost like a lullaby. The old man's words from days ago came back to him. "Once, I thought silence was peace. But I was wrong. This sound, this noise of life, that's peace." And he understood it completely now. Peace wasn't the absence of sound or struggle. It was the presence of hope, of people standing together no matter what. The world outside was still scarred, but humanity had changed. They had learned to fight not with hatred, but with courage. They had learned to rebuild not just cities, but faith. As the stars watched from above and the human ships crossed the sky once more, it was clear. The story of survival had become the story of renewal. Humanity had risen again, not because it was the strongest, but because it refused to give up. And somewhere beyond the hills, as dawn broke for another day, the first rays of sunlight touched the earth gently, like a promise whispered from the heavens. A new day had begun,